In this next video from War, Art and Visual Culture, London, Professor Vivienne Jabri from War Studies, King's College London, chairs a session with Zehra Jumabhoy and Laurie Benson. I hope you enjoy this session.
Okay, so we have our first panel, and this is focusing on art, conflict and the post-colonial world. I thought that this was an important theme to have, because if you look at the wars and conflicts of recent times, they're mostly targeting the post-colonial world and post-colonial populations. And there are a number of artists from the post-colonial world who are engaging with the sorts of themes that we're working with today. And we have two speakers, Laurie Benson, who used to be here in War Studies as a PhD student and is now teaching at SOAS in the Department of Politics over there. And Zehra Jumabhoy, who's from next door at the Koto, and she will be speaking after Laurie. So without further ado, Laurie, it's all yours. You have 15 minutes maximum.
Okay.
And then Zehra follows, and then we'll have a chance for audience discussion.
Okay. Okay, thanks so much, Vivienne. So, as Vivienne mentioned, I come out of War Studies department, a product of it somewhat. So, come at it as an IR scholar rather than a practitioner per se. So, part of what the presentation is trying to do is to think about these forms of amnesia, colonial amnesia, but also the way in which you keep open these spaces of struggle. Saying that as someone working and trying to investigate these artistic practices, but someone who's also slightly outside of that field. So trying to think together some of these conjunctions of the colonial amnesia, talking about it here in the context of France and Algeria, and what and how do we account for those practices of unmaking and rehistoricization. So colonial amnesia, as I understand it, functions in these confused, clogged spaces, different historical trajectories, scholarly dispositions, different sites of practice. And there's an active or willed forgetting. And what I want to talk about today is the context of that kind of forgetting and remembering in the context of France, Algeria, and that post-colonial legacy. We've talked from one of the previous speakers about mediation on Englishness, and perhaps in a sense, what a lot of the artists that I engaged and interviewed are offering is in part sort of mediation on Frenchness and what it means to, in a sense, be a post-colonial subject, but operating within the art world. So the colonial relationship and the post-colonial relationship of France and Algeria is one that remains highly contested. You see that not only in terms of the fact that the Algerian War was only remembered or sort of recognised officially as a war in 1999, but also through more creative practices that we see through artists such as Nebzadira, Kadiatia, and the types of work that they're engaging with. So in a sense, what the presentation wants to do, which forms part of a larger PhD project, is to understand how these practitioners are, in a sense, mediating on these borders, literally in terms of knowledge production and in what kind of sites. And in doing so, that kind of operates from spaces of the banlieue in the city space to spaces in Algiers in particular. Okay. So it's not something that hasn't been negotiated before, and I think it's sort of important to remember that in essence this international space, this translocal space between France and Algeria, is one that has always been kind of contested in various ways. We have sort of the aesthetic rethinking from Cézanne, so on and so on, but you've also had these kind of modes, this politics of reappropriation of art in different ways for the community. So one example of this, in a sense, is the work of the Berber artist Baya, who was picked up on very much by Breton in the context of the early anti-colonial period, but then whose work in an Algerian cultural centre in Paris was kind of retaken up as a moment of kind of the post-colonial. And the newspaper here is saying in the context of the 80s that the work of Baya, they are her stories which formerly sustained our childhood, today shattered by the hard labour of immigration. So in a sense, perhaps you see the moment of the intersection of post-colonial debates around immigration, but also the place of art and exhibition in that. But what the presentation wants to focus on is the work of Zehra, who's probably quite well known within the art world. So that is not only her earlier work on memory and archive, but also the way in which, through her setting up of the art residency space in Algiers, has tried to make an intervention into these sort of institutional landscapes of exchange, as well as through the archival mode. So I want to maybe account for some of the stakes in thinking about these practices, not only given the ambivalence of art, but also this kind of idea of how and where we position shapes how we interpret and think about these artistic practices. And I want to make 3 points. The first is that a lot of these post-colonial practices and artists have been taken up and used within a rethinking of within a kind of post-colonial but also decolonial framework that you see with authors such as Walter Mignolo. And I perhaps just want to firstly suggest that there's more going on, there's more at stake, rather than this kind of abstract rethinking that we see, particularly amongst academic circles, but that comes into play to interpret these practices. And I'll unveil that in the context of the work around this piece, Retelling Histories, and then a second piece, the installation Gardien d'Image, which came out in 2010. So perhaps they're not reducible, as quite often happens in IR, to these kind of discursive readings, but it's through these archival methods that we see the way in which there's a challenge into these landscapes of France and Algeria. So, to move on to, in a sense, this retelling of history. So Kader Attia and Zehra were artists that spoke in a language that was picked up internationally at the kind of height of new internationalism, that kind of point from the 80s, particularly through the 1920s, when there was kind of a celebration of difference within the art world. So a lot of these artists came in and through that, but had a much more sort of conflictual relationship to their exhibition in France, and particularly within Paris, but not only in terms of the form of exhibition. This piece she produced in 2003, but in 2010, when it was shown at an exhibition in the south of France, was censored. The show had to be taken down for a moment for reasons of security, because of one of the translations of the use of Aki as traitor within the piece, because a lot of the local populations in those spaces in the south of France rejected the use of that translation. So perhaps again seeing the kind of institutional politics, but the way in which the art was still contested 2010 and onwards. So when I spoke to Zehra about the piece, she said it was this questioning of the family history, the place of the body, the place of the artist that she wanted to contest. So this is a video piece, and that's Zeneb the artist and her mother, and you see throughout the piece the way in which she recounts these histories of the Algerian War. But she also mentioned that it was the pragmatic sort of decisions around the fact that video offered this kind of medium accessibility at a point where there wasn't the funding for this kind of work that she was trying to do. So in a sense, the way in which the screens, you can't see it here, the screens operate in itself was the first kind of challenge to these narratives around the Algerian War. Second piece in which I want to just speak a little bit about is Gardien d'Image, which came out in 2010, and I'll show a short clip of it in a sec. So Amina Menia and Zeneb both wanted to rescue what was a selection of photographs, an archival set of photographs about the Algerian War, which were sort of damaged, but which had been collected by Safi Kouchi, whose husband, Mohamed Kouchi, was a photographer during the Algerian War. And they're important as photographs, not only because they're accounting of the histories, but because a lot of the dominant kind of visuality narratives around the Algerian War have been through photographers, French photographers, or international photography. So there was a literal need, in a sense, to try and save these photographs. And in a sense, we see with the way in which they tried to intervene, it was through the artistic methods that she was at a point in her career when making the artwork was one way in which to try and gain visibility for the potential saving of the photographs. They needed to be put in specific archival spaces, they needed to be saved and treated, but they also offered this kind of outlook on the Algerian War. So they didn't know how to do it, and what they ended up doing was this exhibition one installation with the two screens in which you see Safra recounting her personal histories on the left side with the archive being developed, and on the right hand side you see her speaking about the Algerian War and with the images that emerged, some of which might be familiar through the kind of imagery of the battle Algiers and so on, but in a sense perhaps offering an intersection of that personal and the political in one way. And Zeynep relates at the time, quote, "How can I help this lady who's struggling with this archive and who doesn't know how to give it more visibility? All I think of is that I don't have the means to preserve and scan the negatives, was to make a piece of work about it, to give it the visibility, hoping that someone would approach her. It's given it visibility as the work has been shown in so many places. It is a piece that is extremely tender, yet very historical or political, if you want." So in a sense, perhaps you see the intersection of the social relations of art and its politics, but also the different kind of necessity in which there's still sort of re-excavation of these histories of Algeria. And it was subsequently shown at Palais Tokyo and onwards. So the last point I just want to make before I show a little bit of some conclusions is that I think importantly, Zehra has also tried to, through a residency space area, try and literally intervene in the institutional exchanges between France and Algeria. I think when artistic exchange is quite often shown, it's as if it is this neutral or sort of mutual exchange. And the one thing that she kind of encountered through pieces like this, that her work in terms of intervening archivally was not just through her art, but her means, the way in which she might increase these kind of spaces as well. And that's where ARIA came into play. Okay. So I just want to show a couple of minutes of this and then just make a couple of conclusions. So in a sense, what I wanted to stress with this and the work that she's done is in a sense the way in which these kind of methods of making and unmaking intervene into these landscapes of France and Algeria, literally, and through this kind of aesthetic intervention. And I think kind of in terms of the kind of forms of pedagogy, that's a kind of unlearning and learning as well in terms of the way in which we methodologically try to account for these practices and the way in which they're ongoing and contested within these landscapes of France and Algeria. I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'm going to give you a bit of a disclaimer, which is I thought this was half an hour long, so I might go on for a little bit longer than Laurie. And if you're getting really bored, you can throw things and tell me to shut up. Also, I'm very much an art historian, so also a curator, so the big bad. And in some ways, what I'm going to give you today is I do work with photography and documentary, but that's kind of not the angle that I kind of wanted to share with you today. And partly the reason for that, because you'll be seeing lots of very hyper-decorative, very pretty pictures, and yet these very pretty hyper-decorative pictures are not innocent. And I thought it was a particularly timely occasion to revisit some of this material, given that just a few days ago, you had Narendra Modi in India, who is now, for the second term, Prime Minister of India, and he comes from the far right, the Hindu right, and we'll be talking a little bit about that today. So Hindutva is kind of like the sort of ideological body behind the BJP, which is the party, the political party that Narendra Modi is sort of prime minister of at the moment. And over the his sort of last reign, as it was, he first comes in with a thumping majority in 2014. There's quite a lot of violence as a result of it. What Hindutva calls for is Hindu Rashtra, that translated means Hindu nation. So it's a particular way of looking at India, which is always, from 1947 onwards, considered itself as secular, and sort of multi-religious. But the BJP line and the Hindutva line, and certainly the Modi line, arguably, is very much, a Hindu India. And so the kind of material I'm going to show you today has to do with visual art, but it also intersects with politics. So the area that we're looking at is Kashmir, which is highly symbolically important, as I hope you'll agree with me, but it's also practically important at the moment, given that one of the interpretations for why Modi, who, about a month before the election started properly, Indian elections go on for a long time. So this election was 6 weeks, and about a few weeks before the election starts in April, there's a general feeling that if Modi does come back, he'll come back not with this kind of majority. In fact, he comes back with a bigger majority than he's ever had before. And there's a lot of focus as to why, and particularly post-justification of the election, the sort of liberal left, and this kind of liberal intelligentsia go, oh yeah, he might have come back on an economic ticket, so let's avoid the sort of Hindu Rashtra nonsense. Actually, he came back because of economic reasons. And really, I don't buy that, because another thing that happened a couple of weeks before the election, which sort of changes the entire scenario, is really as a flare-up in Kashmir, which just really plays into his hands. I mean, it couldn't have come at a better time. So, and this sort of interpretation of actually what did happen is also completely skewed in the lead-up to the election, something that I'll also show you a little bit about. But so much for that, and you'll now get a little sort of snippet of very pretty pictures before we get some unpleasant realities. So, totally not working, so you're not going to get a pretty picture, you're just going to get lots of facts. So this is a sort of video that I was going to be showing you on not a great artist, to be honest, and it's quite exciting that the worse an artist is, the more interesting their work really is for interpretation, particularly in terms of politics. Anyway, so this was a Pakistani artist who makes some sort of very kind of abstract expressionist paintings on this particular region. And the reason I wanted you to see the video is that he visits this region, which is on the border with Azad Kashmir. So Azad Kashmir means free Kashmir. Of course, there's nothing free about it. Azad Kashmir actually belongs to Pakistan. And he goes quite romantically, actually, to this region and on the borderline with it. And you can see the mountains, which we'll be seeing quite a lot in the images that I will show you. And he takes, he's a Pakistani artist, but he takes with him an Indian Sufi singer. And they go looking for this lake called Saiful Maluk. And the thing about this lake is that it's very symbolically important for Sufi poetry. And the story behind Saiful al-Malik is, and they play music alongside the lake, and the story, it's called Saiful al-Maluk because it's named after an ancient Persian prince, so it's a fairy tale really. An ancient Persian prince has a dream of this lake and a beautiful fairy that he meets there. And so he gets up and he tells his father the next day, who was the king, I don't really want your kingdom. I'm going off to look for my fairy. And of course it doesn't end very well. It takes him a long time to get to this lake. And when he does, humans and fairies don't mate very well. So it's a sad story. And the reason I'm bringing it up is A, because it's a Sufi fable. And the thing about this story is sort of connected to the region that we're looking at. So Sufism is a devotional, it's religious, it's Islamic, but it's a devotional practice. and it has to do with the longing of the soul for the divine. So it's not an orthodox religion, and this is particularly the kind of Sufi past that this area called Kashmir, which we'll be looking a lot at, is very sort of embedded with. And it's a very plural, very syncretic, kind of multicultural, in some ways very fluidly religious area. And that's its history. So it's very connected with Sufism and Sufi shrines. And so the logic that we'll be looking at and how that logic of this highly symbolic area, both for the Indian and the Pakistani national narratives, has over the last, since independence, since 1947, been completely, in some ways, converted for political gain on both sides of the fence. And of course, what I'm talking about today is I'm particularly looking at Indian, not Pakistani, Indian Muslim artists and how they revisit this area in their artworks. And the difference between their narrative and the narrative that you're seeing coming out of the Indian political landscape, both in terms of the sort of territorial claims to Kashmir, because of course Kashmir is fought over by both India and Pakistan, and all the way from independence on, you have a line of control. It's disputed territory, and so I'm going to take you to some of those sort of the backdrop of that, and then we'll look quite closely at two artists. One being Rakeem Shaw, who is Kashmiri, but lives in London, and the other one being Nilima Sheikh, who is not Kashmiri. She's from Baroda, but she's also Indian Muslim, and how they revisit this terrain and what it means to them, but also at some level, what I want you to keep at the back of your mind is, what does art actually contribute to political dialogues? At some point, is there an ethics to making work about areas that are highly contested? And is there a way of making work about these areas that is innocent? Or are you always plugging some kind of a line because of where you come from and because of your own sort of communal interests in a particular region and what it symbolizes? And it might be the nicest of things that you want to point to that. You might want to look at Kashmir in a very syncretic light, but that too is an agenda. And so some of the ethical implications behind the use of beauty in a particular way. So this is the fairy tale lake. So these are some of the things in popular culture, as it were, but sort of the ancient Mughal. So the Mughals were a South Asian dynasty, as I'm sure everybody knows. And if you don't, well, that's a big problem, I think, for this talk. So the Mughals were this very romantic South Asian dynasty. They were Muslim, also quite syncretic, especially the sort of early kind of the great Mughals. They're known for beautiful jewelry, beautiful clothes, palaces, the Taj Mahal, all of that stuff. They're also known for their love of Kashmir, because of course the Mughals came from, they came through the Khyber Pass and entered South Asia, and what they sort of longed for were gardens. And there's sort of lots of records of, Babur as he comes through, and in his diary he writes, "What is this horrible, ugly land? They have no melons here." And so the thing that the Mughals did was that they built gardens. And obviously Kashmir, because of where it's located, right, up there with the sort of Himalayas, was very lush and very green. So it was their summer retreat. And again, sort of it got very invested in terms of their rhetoric about themselves. So with sort of the idea of Kashmir, you have in both the Indian and Pakistani imagination also an idea of Kashmir as a lost paradise or as paradise. And so you have this sort of quote from Jahangir, which I'm giving you over here, which is, if there be a paradise on earth, it is this, it is this, it is this being the Kashmir. So a kind of Garden of Eden thing. And also you had sort of the ancient Silk Route going through Kashmir, also kind of important for some of the symbolism we'll be looking at later on. And with the Silk Route you had not just trade, but you had a sort of melting pot of different cultures. So this ancient seeds of Buddhism went through Kashmir, not just the sort of from this region, from the 13th century onwards, there was Islam, but it was very much a sort of melting pot of religions and cultures and trade. And so these are some of these kind of paradisical reference points that are attached to this area. And of course, like lots of Sufis. So Amir Khusro was meant to be the Sufi saint who actually coined that phrase that Jahangir then picks up on, if there's a paradise on earth. So in, again, sort of pre-independence, pre-1947, in the sort of popular Indian, British Indian at this point, imagination, you have a lot of artists who are kind of asking for Indian independence, and they are quite obsessed with this area as well, as a sort of, an ancient, syncretic, beautiful past. And so you have the Bengal school, someone like Rabindranath Tagore, who has knighted Shalimar, and that's Emperor Shah Jahan looking at the Shalimar Gardens in Kashmir. And of course you can see the Himalayas in the distance over here. So this is just, I'm showing you the Shalimar Gardens, Mughal gardens. And the reason I'm giving you all of this backdrop is because you will recognize these things when we look at the images of the artists looking at. More fairies and fairy tales associated with Kashmir. So one of the most syncretic emperors that never was of the Mughal era was Dara Shikoh. And I say he never was because he never became emperor. He was a favorite son of Shah Jahan, and Emperor Shah Jahan wanted him to be emperor after him. But what happens is that his brother Aurangzeb, who was always much vilified in the Indian imagination, because Aurangzeb is an Orthodox Muslim, and he he kills Dara Shikoh and takes the throne in his stead. So Dara Shikoh, as part of he was a scholar, he was a sort of scholar, poet, prince, wasn't very good at the fighting stuff, which obviously you need to be. So he built this thing in Kashmir, the Palace of Fairies. So I'm giving you all of this fairy tale stuff so that you then have context when we look at the images. And of course, Kashmir, particularly pre-independence and even a little bit after that, you have lots of movies made about it, and it's famous honeymoon spot. So then, all of the things that we need to know in the symbolic imagination what Kashmir paradise on earth represents: Silk Route, Buddhism, sort of intercultural mixing, Dara Shikoh's sort of land, as it were, and a meeting point. I'm not really going to talk about this image. So that was then. Now, you also have a different sort of warrior dreaming of Kashmir and the Himalayas, and that's Modi. And so Kashmir was very, very helpful for this hero as well. And the reason that it was is that, I'm actually going to read out a little bit of this, is, so this is what happens in the lineup. Or sort of what happens, this is what the newspapers present happened. An Indian jet was brought down, so on the border you have a skirmish. You have Pakistani trained militants from Azad Kashmir going across the border into Indian occupied Kashmir. And it starts, what Modi starts announcing is going to be yet another war between India and Pakistan. So this is what the newspaper reports. An Indian jet was brought down during the flight and its pilot captured when he it's a very strange newspaper, when he was ejected onto the Pakistani side of the border. He was later released. India said it too had shot down a Pakistani aircraft, and the Air Force displayed pieces of a missile that it had said had been fired by a Pakistani F-16 before it went down. So the Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, who had said that India had taught Pakistan a lesson, and he is campaigning, and this is the last line of the article, he is campaigning ahead of the elections next week. Walking or something. Anyway, so this is sort of this is what is kind of announced is that what's announced is that this is India victorious, it's shot down. It's retaliated, it's sort of taken over Pakistani plane, and Pakistan should be quite frightened, I think. Modi comes up with the line. In the meantime, you have Prime Minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan, taking like the high moral ground and saying, this is just war hysteria. But what it does do is it immediately boosts Modi's kind of election rating, and as we know, he sort of wins the election. So these are just a few images of what what actually created the situation that we have now, where you have Kashmir and the sort of border between India and Pakistan, with Kashmir right in the sort of with the line of control running through Kashmir. And of course, this is an area which, just to tell you, that is very symbolic, as I said, for both sides of the dialogue. In terms of India, it's very symbolic for the Hindu right, because Kashmir was a land pre-independence, which was a Muslim majority population ruled by a Hindu Maharaja. And so as far as the Hindu right is concerned, Kashmir ought to belong to India, and they kind of, because it's a Muslim majority state, this is kind of where they launch their biggest sort of ideological attacks against the Muslims. So it's symbolic for them for that reason. For the Indian, intelligentsia and sort of the liberal left and the artists, it is highly symbolic because it's proof that India can be secular, that it is syncretic, that it includes Indian Muslims as well as Hindus, and Kashmir is a sort of paradise on earth, which symbolized that in ancient times. So I'm just going to take you through the now and all the sort of problems. We've already done this, and sort of this is kind of like this precarious line of control that goes through this region. This is the Pakistani artist who sort of draws that. And sort of India, the divider under Modi now in terms of the kind of stance he's taken on the Indian Muslims. So as sort of the political situation around Kashmir gets more and more and more kind of anguishful, and it's sort of the center of conflict, artists seem to be retreating into a kind of looking at Kashmir in this highly romantic, very idealized sort of way. And the first artist I'm going to look at is Minima Sheikh, and then the one that I will end with is Rakeem Shaw. And these are just to give you some of the...
Time's up.
Shall I just end?
Yeah, that's okay. Sorry, we just need to keep time, and
okay.
I think Vivienne wants a bit of time for questions.
Questions, and okay, I'll just end on this image. Yeah. Sorry, so we just have
Sorry to rush.
Yeah.
Sorry. Okay.
that you might have a bit of audience participation, so that you guys are not just sitting there listening, but rather communicating. So, gosh, I found that so interesting, this idea of contested landscapes and the difficulties of, or I should say for the post-colonial subject traversing these spaces of conflict and contestation. And Laurie's piece, I thought the most interesting thing, it was all interesting, but one of the things that really struck me was politically in the way in which in France there's a claim to the Algerian origin artists. This is French art. But at the same time, when it's shown, there's censorship and contest and a kind of politics of identity emerges once again. So, Laurie, I thought the video you showed of Zehra's work on the archive was particularly interesting, and it will connect to a later discussion we'll have with Vivienne as well. How evocative the archive is when the post-colonial subject comes into contact with it. Can you say a bit more about that video that you showed?
Yeah, sure. I think in the context of sort of archiving, a lot of some of the history is visible, and I think the point you mentioned about sort of this contestation over French art and the archiving, that at moments it's right there. You see it beyond art with the riots, you see it in kind of these spaces of Paris and the city. But I think what's interesting about these artists' work is they're very aware of that positioning as diaspora, as a critical or not position, and the way in which they kind of use that not only generally in the context of the arts, but specifically as a kind of strategy in relation to archiving. And I think about the piece there, what was important was, I guess there's a pragmatic element to it, in a sense of, if there's not these infrastructures in Algiers in the same way, how can someone who has gained celebrity, in a sense, through that kind of positioning as diaspora, use it in a way which nonetheless offers a kind of aesthetic, historical and personal interrogation of this landscape. So I guess the landscape here is the Algerian War, which again you see, you've got the Battle of Algiers, you've got these highly sort of visible sort of accounts of those landscapes, but there's very little done either, or sort of visible by those who are perhaps sort of Algerian or in that contested space. So I think what it does is, in a sense, is a kind of way in which to try and protect these photographs. And I think more generally, what she sort of mentioned as an artist in her archiving role is that having those kind of networks and connections, setting up the residency space in Algiers was also a way of, in a sense, giving back or intervening, because it's not an equal space of exchange. And a lot of the Algerian artists who have issues with visas and so on. I think there was an exhibition at, I think it was at Manchester, I think with the university, where it was about connections, something on hybridity, and a lot of the Algerian artists whose work was exhibited couldn't get there because they couldn't get the visa. So I guess that kind of shows some of that politics and where she's trying to make that intervention in trying to sort of enable as best possible those kind of interconnections which aren't or haven't been there. And I think it's tied to the longer history, the Algerian War, but also the Civil War as well, and the way in which that kind of, the question of exile artists are mentioned. So I think that is kind of what the archive, the politics of it is. And I think she's tried to go back and do work, for example, after Charlie Hebdo, on the Algerian cartoonists who were accounting for the Algerian space, but who were either quite sort of targeted, sort of assassinated, or who were in exile in France. So I think that's another way in which she's trying to sort of re-embrace and sort of build up this archive. So not just something as sort of an accounting for, we've got these photographs, but as a kind of way in which to offer a mode of exchange. And I guess as an IR person, thinking about that international and then those translocal sites, what is exciting with her work.
And Zehra, I thought the issue you brought up, connecting with Simon's earlier talk, is this notion of the ethics of, in a sense, beautifying conflict spaces, let alone the politics of it that you concentrated on. But can you say a bit more about how the artists themselves talk about the, if you like, the aestheticization of this very beautiful region, and yet it's a deadly region as well?
Yeah. Actually, it's quite good that I deliberately ended that slide there so we could at least get like one sort of. So what you have in this image, and this is Rakeem Shaw. So he is a Kashmiri sort of artist who lives in London. His childhood was spent in Kashmir, and he does these very, very super ornate paintings, almost like jewels. So I've got a sort of a little Mughal jewel, which is like a water sprinkler, highly decorated. And this is kind of like the filigree work that you will find in terms of how he constructs his paintings. So with the enamel work in the gold. And of course what he is depicting is himself sitting almost like a Sufi, or in Krishna blue. So there's kind of debate as to why he's actually chosen that color, but like Krishna is the god of love, and it's a kind of very Sufi pose. And behind that, of course, is the landscape of Kashmir, but it's the Mughal landscape of Kashmir, so that's Hari Prabhat, and you can see that over there. And so there's this image where you have him being offered the sprinkler, and the rose water sprinkler was usually used as a gift. And so it's the sort of, he calls them art world wolves offering him this gift. And it's a sort of seduction into the art world. So this is kind of what this image is about. But it's also about that landscape of his past, and it's a past that he can never really go back to. So there's a kind of moral ambiguity even in how he's depicting it. It's that he's kind of, in a way, given it up at some level, that, you know, this is a kind of idyllic past, and that landscape only now exists in this kind of heavily sort of beautiful way in his brain, because in actual fact this is a landscape of disaster. And I think the fact that these kind of paintings are so ornate, they're like jewels, they sell at jewel-like prices, is also what is kind of being problematized here, and maybe there isn't an answer. And in fact, like his recent interview, he's done a whole series of Kashmiri landscapes, and his recent interview actually talks about going back to Kashmir now with his friend on a holiday, and he says, you know, I'm quite traumatized about this, because really the Kashmir that I have is the Kashmir of my memory, and as we know, he says, you know, memory isn't reality, and so it's this sort of, it is a kind of giving up. It's a feel that
there's a great melancholia.
Yeah.
Within
this work.
Yeah. Okay, well thanks, I thought that was fabulous. Thank you very much. And let's